Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Case, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is very, very special. It is one of the first in a bunch of episodes coming down the pike from Mindfest 2023, where I was down at FAU, Florida Atlantic University, for the inaugural Mindfest, hosted by Susan Schneider, and it was an amazing time. I want to thank everyone who made that possible by giving to the GoFundMe. And I'm back with the goods. So these are the fruits of our combined labor. I'm really excited for it. I have with me Dr. Garrett Mindt, and I should have asked if that's how you pronounce his name, but he's got a perfect name for philosophy of mind. It's mind with a T, which is pretty awesome. So I'll have to ask him about that. But we're going to be getting into a bit of his presentation at Mindfest on like the consciousness of non-linguistic animals. So we'll be talking about cerebral organoids or mini brains, little like petri dish brains, consciousness, theories of consciousness, philosophy of mind. So stay tuned, and you will be an expert in all of those things. Before we jump in, I want to thank everyone on Patreon and my YouTube members. If you guys like this podcast, please help me keep the lights on. Please help me feed my dog Theophilus by supporting the podcast. You can find those links in the description. But without further ado, let's jump in to some philosophy of mind and consciousness and all that good stuff. Garrett, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm excited.
I didn't ask you, but how do you say your last name?
Mint, the D is silent. So
Nice.
it does work
Nice.
with mind for T, but
Perfect. Yeah,
everyone keeps telling me to cut out the T. Actually, David Chalmers at the conference was like, you got to drop the T.
that's right.
Yeah, a little forced.
Yeah. Well, so you're an associate professor of philosophy at Florida Atlantic University, and then the program director at the Center for the Future Mind. How did we end
Mhm.
up here? How'd you end up here? Like, what'd you do your dissertation on, and where'd you do that at?
Yeah, so it's been a kind of a wild ride. So my PhD dissertation I did at Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. So I
Mhm.
was out there for about 4 and some change years. My supervisor out there was Philip Goff, and then when he left for Durham, Tim Crane took over. But the question I was looking at for my PhD research was broadly, can we give an information theoretic explanation of consciousness? And so, in some ways, the major backdrop for that was the hard problem of consciousness and integrated information theory.
Yeah.
And so, it was a bit of an extension for my master's thesis. And essentially, I end on the thesis that yes, we can give an information theoretic explanation of consciousness, given some caveats and some argumentation. But yeah,
Yeah.
so
That's
yeah.
awesome, dude. Those are two of some of my favorite thinkers, Philip Goff and Tim Crane. They've both been on the
Oh,
podcast. Yeah, Goff is coming
oh,
back
oh,
on in a couple weeks. It's gonna be awesome.
oh, oh,
So
that's cool. Thanks.
that's huge, man. I knew I liked you. This is great. Um,
Yeah.
this is so cool. Well, can you integrated information theory is one that gets thrown around a
Mhm.
lot, and I'd love to just broach that for the listeners. Can you give us an overview? Like, what is that theory of consciousness?
Yeah, for sure. So before coming to Florida Atlantic University, I was doing a postdoc for 2 years with Giulio Tononi,
Hmm.
and that was on the philosophical foundations for science of consciousness. And so one of the interesting things, and maybe this is what drew me to IIT and looking into IIT mainly is, uh, to a large extent, it's a phenomenology first kind of approach to consciousness, which is distinct maybe from a lot of scientific theories of consciousness, right? Which maybe takes more of a brain first approach.
Yeah.
So, what is it structurally about the brain? How do we connect that up to consciousness or cognition, say, in some instances? And what does that tell us? IIT does it a little bit differently, right? It starts by trying to characterize, say, the essential features of our
Mm.
experience and giving axioms. And those axioms are sort of like, kind of, in some ways, irrefutable characteristics about experience that any theory of consciousness should account for. And then it takes those axioms and it translates them into what they call physical systems postulates. And so those would be kind of the bread and butter, like how does the system or the mechanism, how does that generate experience based off certain principles, right? And the
Yeah.
postulate come with like mathematical formalism, which is really fun to try to get into and learn as a philosopher. Why I tried to pick that daunting task, I will never understand during my master's, but I think I was naive enough to think I could. I learned very quickly I couldn't, but the people who develop IoT, Giulio Tononi, and the people at his lab are more than kind and helpful in communicating with people, and they're particularly interested in the philosophical implications
Mm,
for developing a full consciousness. Uh, my work was mainly on what is IT, or just even the endeavor of trying to come up with science of consciousness. In some ways, what does that tell us about the nature of science more generally? So,
mm,
does a science of the subjective change what it means to do science in a way, or is it just sort of a separate thing that's sort of a unique scientific discipline in itself? This type of trying to give objective explanations of subjective phenomenon, does that change how we should go about doing it? It's just a question that interested me, and no better way to answer that question than to live as a philosopher with scientists for a couple of years. So that was the
yeah.
postdoc. But if you want me to comment maybe more generally on the theory, I can do that as well.
Yeah,
I think
well,
that was
how is that
but
how is that integrated into your, like, information theoretic, uh, theory of consciousness? Like, how much work did it do in yours? Is that just the same thing? Is that synonymous? I don't even know, like, help me think about that.
yeah, yeah. So in my dissertation, I sort of developed metaphysics of consciousness, or metaphysics
Nice.
of mind. So the question of, what is it about consciousness and its place in reality? What does that tell us about the nature of reality?
Yeah,
And so, in answering this question, can we give an information theoretic explanation of consciousness? In some ways, I wanted to one ask questions about the nature of information more generally, using the mind and consciousness as kind of a backdrop.
yeah,
But in some ways, what is the kind of like metaphysics or ontology of information? Now, it sounds kind of strange, right? Because we usually think of information as being processed, or the things that computers compute, right? So
right.
computers send information to each other. When I send you a text message, I'm sending you information. Might be relevant, might not be relevant. Gift, joke. It still has information, right? And so, sometimes famously, right? So Searle talks about information. John Searle talks about information being the observer dependent
Yeah,
phenomenon, right? So to have this kind of independent existence, to some extent, I wanted to ask the question: what if information does have an independent existence? Can we kind of conceptualize reality in a way that gets us past sort of the hard problem of consciousness, or the mind body problem, gets us past maybe some of these age old questions about, how does consciousness come about in physical systems? I developed what I call information theoretic neutral structuralism, which is a neutral monist position
oh,
that takes
sweet.
that takes information as sort of like the neutral entity,
Yeah,
and then tries to explain why things like the concepts of the physical and the mental kind of even arise in the first place. In some sense, it was way too big of a project to tackle for my PhD. Luckily, Philip and Tim were very patient with me and everybody else, and I somehow muddled together a collection of essays that passed. But it's kind of a project that I'm still working on,
yeah,
and I don't think it'll end anytime soon. But
yeah.
yeah,
No, that's
yeah,
so
yeah.
fascinating. There's this philosophy of religion philosophy of religion circles. They're starting to get into information theory, and using it as like a neutral monism. This
Mhm.
one Cambridge element, God and abstract objects. I don't know how to say his name, but Einar Bone, maybe this one right here. He's basically goes in for something like that, to
Okay.
explain minds, but also to explain God and say like, well, God is like pure information. So, for my
Mhm.
Phil religion folks, there is some overlap here with the neutral monism type stuff, which is awesome.
Oh,
I
interesting.
wonder
Okay.
I wonder about I think of Searle and I think of him describing like rings in a tree. Like, so you cut a tree in half, you
Mhm.
see all these rings, and you could say like, well, in a sense, those rings are information about how long or how old the tree is. And he says, well,
Mhm.
it's observer relative because the rings could tell about the age of the tree, but the age of the tree can also tell about the rings, and it kind of depends on your own perspective. And
Mhm.
I've just kind of taken that for granted. Like, how do we get past the his observer relativity type thesis where we say like, no, there isn't there information has an ontology of its own apart from an subjective observer.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the confusing things too is, in some ways, we use information to kind of, this is a kind of umbrella term to capture
Oh
all
yeah,
kinds of things, right?
sure.
In some ways, um, anything that informs us, right, is information, right?
Yeah,
And so when you think of the rings of a tree, that's giving us information about its age,
yeah,
right? And in some ways, there's all kinds of information we can get from nature, right? And in some ways, uh, when we ask the question, well, what is the nature of the existence of information, or say like, what is the nature of its being, or does it have a being that's distinct, right?
yeah,
So there's a very common view, right? A very popular view about um, there is no such thing as kind of information distinct from, say, the physical objects that realize it, right?
Yeah.
So you might ultimately, the thing that exists is the physical object. Information is what is given off by it, or something like that, right? So its existence is dependent upon the physical.
Right.
Uh, I think, right, this is part of what I argue in my dissertation and my current work, right? I actually think this has sort of a kind of problematic assumption about the nature of reality, right? This kind of, and I call it a priority question, right? And in some ways, it's weird to ask this question about could information exist uh, independent of itself, but I think that's only because the priority is assumed, right? The priority is assumed on the side of the physical or the mental, as these age-old debates have always gone, right?
Right. Right.
So it's hard then to kind of motivate, well, imagine distinct from physical or mental reality, distinct from physical or mental objects, right? Imagine information on its own, just
Yeah.
floating out there.
Yeah.
Really, that's where we get everything. The way I try to think about it, and maybe this helps with the kind of thinking about it as an independent thing. If we flip that priority question, right, and we don't ask the question of, well, how do we get information from the physical and mental, but we flip that priority and we ask the question, can we make sense of the universe that the physical and the mental exist without information?
Mm.
And I actually think that is much more revealing when you're asking this question about, can we give an information theoretic explanation of consciousness or reality, et cetera? I think that actually is very revealing, right? Because think about the way that we come to know reality, right? We come to think about reality. We engage with it. We engage with the information that exists, right?
Yeah.
Say senses, or maybe even the way that we cognize it, right? We think about it.
Yeah.
In some ways, we're always manipulating information. There's a kind of famous view from John Archibald Wheeler, this it from bit view, sometimes called digital physics, right? So
Yeah.
common one is that we live in this kind of participatory universe, right? Two particles interact with each other. They sort of pose a yes or no question, and they respond no by repelling one another, or yes by attracting,
Yeah.
right? With kind of view, it's in some ways it's still this idea that the physical is where we get this information. It's these physical interactions. I think it's very interesting when you flip that priority question and you actually go, well, can we actually make better sense of reality
Mm.
if we accept in some ways that information is maybe more fundamental than physical and mental? Can we solve something like the hard problem? Can we give a more unified picture about the natural sciences? And in some ways, I think that's the way to get to this path of, is there an independent existence?
Mm.
By no means am I claiming that I figured
Yeah.
out
Right.
there's independent nature of information. In some ways, it's kind of an exploratory project, right?
Yeah.
In some ways, I want to see, can I give the best possible explanation using this? And if I can, I'm increasingly more convinced that it's the better picture of reality, and a more unifying picture of reality than maybe we've gotten previously with this kind of stuck dichotomy between the physical and the mental.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
That
I have an answer to your question.
No,
Should I
no,
follow?
that's so
Yeah.
good. So I think you already answered my next one, but I wanna poke on it some more. The fundamental question or fundamentality question, like, so, inputting information as this neutral monism, is that saying
Mhm.
that there's 3 worlds or something like that, where it's like there's the mental world, there's the physical world, and there's the informational world? Or is it like, no, the ground level, most fundamental is information, and then mind and matter arise out of that? Are they all like equal, or is there a fundamental, like a, yeah, like a hierarchy?
Yeah, I think maybe the best way to think about it is maybe a way that maybe neutral monisms get parsed out more generally.
Mhm.
You sometimes have the difference between a neither view and a both view in neutral
Yeah.
monism.
Yeah.
So a both view would be that ultimately the nature of reality is both physical and mental,
Yeah.
and it has this sort of, maybe to borrow a phrase from Bertrand Russell, this kind of common ancestor, which would be information, right? But ultimately, say the nature of reality is physical, mental. They're just kind of two sides of the same coin. So
Oh, yeah.
you
Okay.
might think certain dual aspect monist views are a kind of both view about
Yeah.
neutral monism. Not all, but some. But then you have the neither view, and the neither view would be that the ultimate nature of reality, whatever it might be, say we're assuming it's neutral, developing neutral monism, is neither physical nor mental.
Okay.
I'm inclined to go with that view.
Okay.
That's not to say that I don't think we conceptualize the world in physical or mental concepts. Obviously, we do all the time.
Right.
I don't think we should reject ever using physical or mental concepts. In some ways, a job, I think, of any kind of, say, neither view about neutral monism, particularly in information theoretic neutral monism, in some ways, you need to explain why those concepts even came about in the first place. Why do we conceptualize the world in the physical and the mental concepts if its ultimate nature is information or something like that,
Right.
right? In some ways, that's one of the trickiest parts of doing a neutral monism, right? Is like, well, why did we start parsing the world this way, right? It's one thing to just say, well, historical inertia. right? Well, because we've used those concepts so much, and those are what the debates are couched in. It's a little bit different though, and it's like, oh, like, ontologically and the nature of the being of the thing. Where does these concepts come from?
Right.
It gets a little tricky. I ultimately I think a lot of that has to do with the nature of our explanations about the
Okay.
worlds, right? It's incredibly useful, right? And so, I mean, one of the things I give in my dissertation and more recent work, in some ways, we have these kinds of pragmatic constraints or explanatory constraints, right? And
Mhm.
perfectly fine and justified in those scenarios to use things like physical mental concepts. They're useful, right? They help us with what I kind of agreed upon use of these terms, make sense of it. In some ways, I don't think that should be in any way indicative of what the ultimate nature of reality is, right? If we're
Yeah.
kind of doing that speculative attempt at, putting the world to rights or putting reality to rights, right? Like telling it what it is. In some ways, I want to keep those concepts as kind of epistemic tools that we use, and then ultimately explain, like metaphysically or ontologically, why information is actually a better kind of fundamental ingredient. So to
Mm.
kind of answer your first question, I don't so much think there's two or three worlds, right? There's
Okay.
three worlds of, say, the information theoretic and the physical and the mental, and they will interact in a certain way. Ultimately, I want to be a little deflationary about the physical and the mental, and really make that much stronger claim that the best way to make sense of reality is to accept that information plays that kind of fundamental role. And it's actually a much more unifying, say, metaphysical ontological entity than the physical and the mental ever were,
Yeah.
in a way. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, so working with Tim Crane, I'm sure you probably thought about like the intentionality of information because he's kind of like
Mhm.
the intentionality guy. Um,
Yeah. It came up a couple times.
yeah. Like I don't know. Like we're talking about what we're going so deep on, like what the ontology of information is. How does how does information have intentionality if it's like the fundamental thing? Like,
Hmm.
it seems like information is about things,
Hmm.
and if information is prior to things, like material or mental, how does it have its intentionality, I guess? Does that your
Yeah.
question even make sense?
It does, and it's
Okay.
something that Tim and I, debated quite a bit, right?
Oh,
Because I think
nice,
he
okay.
he had a similar one, right? By no means should I say that I have convinced anyone at any point of this that this is
Sure.
the case, right?
Yeah.
To an extent, it was an exercise in, masochism, trying to argue these things, particularly with Tim and Philip, right? As a Philip, devout panpsychist or cosmopsychist, Tim's very much about intentionality and representation, right? So trying to convince them that there was some credence to this idea, which seems a
Yeah,
little crazy at first, right?
sure.
It was a little tricky, and this exact question came up a lot with Tim, right? And this question of where does the intentionality, right? Where's the aboutness? Or you might even think, what's the intentional object, right?
Right.
Everything is just information. Where do we get that, right? And classically, we think of intentionality as one of these marks of the mental, right? Mental, qualia and intentionality as being marks of the mental. I think here, I don't know if it's a satisfying response. It's the best one that I've come up with so far. I'm
Yeah.
hoping I come up with a better one eventually. But I think there's actually kind of an elegant solution to this question when it comes to conceptualizing, this information theoretic neutral structuralism. And that's a sense of the aboutness we get is the kind of differentiation that you can get from structure. So you might have remembered, right, from Mindfest with Stephen Wolfram's talk, right, where he talks about how you can get, right, from very simple rules, uh, incredibly complex
Yeah.
patterns, interactions,
It's
right,
mind
using
blowing.
cellular.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely amazing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, his books are always absolutely gigantic.
Yeah.
New kind of science, though, it's incredibly interesting in that sense, right? We sometimes have this idea that, you know, like say representational object or the attentional object. That's a kind of it's like a construction that happens because of physical reality or mental mixes together. And the interesting thing is, you don't need anything particularly complex at the fundamental level to get incredible complexity at higher levels of organization, right?
Yeah.
And when we're talking about something like intentionality, right? We're talking about intentional objects or the aboutness of our experience. We're talking about a higher level of organization, right? Say the spatial temporal grain of the typical human experience,
Right.
right? So we're experiencing the universe at this spatial temporal grain, but it exists at all different levels of organization, right?
Mhm.
And in some ways, right, particularly if you have a kind of structural notion of information, like the one that I try to utilize in my work, you can actually explain the kind of increasing complexity through levels of organization and why there is a kind of aboutness to what maybe seems at the fundamental like indifferentiated information.
Hmm.
right? But then organized and structured in a very specific way to give us the kind of building blocks that our whole world's created, our whole reality is created out of, right? At varying levels of spatial temporal organization. Well, then you actually get much more complex objects and much more complex structures. And in some sense, the intentionality or the aboutness of those things kind of comes out differently. Now
Yeah.
it's a little kind of bizarre, right? Because when we talk about intentionality, we're talking about our experience of something, right? The aboutness of it. Ultimately, I try to tease that out. I talk about it a little bit in the dissertation, this question about the marks of the mental
Hmm.
in this kind of information theoretic turn, more in reference to IET and how it handles the marks of the mental. But I think the question still comes out of, in some ways, if the best way, like say, to borrow something from like Dennett, right? This idea of real patterns. So what is it that we go out and we seek when we try to give a scientific explanation or a natural explanation of the world? Well, the best thing that we can do, right, is get a bunch of patterns that we pick up in reality, right, or about nature.
Hmm.
And the best ones that we have are the ones that say are the most revealing about reality. Those real patterns, those are the best that our science explains, right? The structural explanation,
Yeah.
not just similar to how Russell thought about, our physical explanations of reality. In some ways, our experience is about those things. It's about those patterns in reality. And the nice thing about information, right, is it lends itself to this kind of typical computational language, not unlike Stephen Wolfram's cellular automata view about reality, right?
Hmm.
His view about physics, following these kind of computational rules, it gives us a language that's much more congruent with that picture, right? Where you can get these kind of this incredible complexity in nature at various levels of organization, at various spatial temporal grains, from what seems like a rather kind of austere, bare bones thing,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
location or information. But in reality, it's not just about, say, the information, it's about how it's organized and structured, right? In some ways, that's a lesson that I try to take from IET, which has a very similar view, right? In some ways, the information, although it's interesting if, say, that was the ultimate nature of reality, it's really how it's composed and structured and organized that's really interesting. And that's where you get the kind of dynamicism or the kind of differentiation that we not only get in experience, but that we see in reality all
Yeah.
around us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, man, this is fantastic. So, okay, let me jump on that. So, if we get okay, wait, maybe is we're talking about like undifferentiated information at
Mhm.
maybe the ground level. If you so because information is fundamental. So if we do like an Ant-Man experiment where we get Ant-Man suits and we start shrinking all the way down to the quantum level,
Mhm.
eventually, like would we get down to like the information level? Would you say,
Mhm.
or is it not? Is it not working like that?
It's a good question. I'd be lying if I said I knew the answer to that question, right? I think in some sense, I think the project is still at the like, well, a bit like how maybe Philip Goff argues for panpsychism or cosmopsychism, right?
Yeah,
Like, assume this about that fundamental nature of reality.
yeah,
Look at the work it does. If that's the work it does, we should accept the view based on that.
right.
And
Even
kind of,
with a crazy stare, yeah, incredulous stares. Be damned. Like,
yeah,
yeah,
and I really respect Philip on this, right? Because he's like a dog of a bone, right? No matter how wild it seems, he's
yeah,
like, but look the work it does, right? And if I'm stuck between that or accepting, something like Hempel's dilemma for physicalism, I'd rather
right.
take
Seriously,
panpsychism,
yeah,
right?
I'm with you.
I'd rather not be vacuously true or just patently false from the outgo. I'd rather take this kind of view that seems a little kind of wild on the outset, but does all this work, right?
Yeah,
I took a similar approach. That's not to say that I don't think there should be an answer to that question, right? I think the answer to that question actually comes with, in some ways, perhaps the fundamental level is the least interesting place that we could possibly look, right?
right.
It kind of picture about the world,
Yeah,
right? In some ways, what it means for, and it could be that this idea of a fundamental level couldn't possibly exist in this type of a world, right? Or reality, because ultimately it's about how it's structured and how it's organized. And in
right.
some ways, again, that's another like lesson that I want to give credit to IT for, right? Is that in IT you have this idea that it's integrated information that exists. Isn't integrated information, right? Or it has the right kind of integration and differentiation. It doesn't exist. And it's a kind of strong claim, right? Because then it's like the only things that exist then are conscious entities. Uh, and to some extent, it's not so dissimilar to that kind of Cartesian insight, right? That's why IT talks about the Cartesian insight, right?
Yeah.
Khajiit, there goes to, we all love that,
Yeah, yeah.
just like today in the intro class. Um, but it is kind of this insight, and it makes you think like, well, if it doesn't experience or it doesn't enter into consciousness, in some sense, it doesn't matter, right? And
Mm,
for all intents and purposes, maybe it doesn't exist. And so I tend to think that, IT has something to say there. I think this kind of metaphysics or ontology about information also has something to say there in terms of like, well, if it's really like structure that we're trying to pick out with our scientific or natural investigation of the world, these real patterns, then in some ways it's structure all the way down, right? And that's why in a way it's a combination of information theoretic neutral monism and ontic structural realism from someone like
oh,
Lademan and Ross's work, right?
yeah.
Where I'm accepting that what really exists reality, right? It's structure. It's not just the nature of our explanations of the world. It quite literally is how the world is in and of itself. And
Yeah.
so ultimately, those information structures uh, are, kind of, you might think of points of kind of lack of uniformity in this otherwise indifferentiated space of fundamental information, whatever that
Yeah.
means.
Yeah, yeah.
And overall, I don't think it's too dissimilar to how weird it is to think of undifferentiated matter at the fundamental
I
level,
know,
right?
right. Whatever is at the fundamental is nuts.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, and
Or
I think
or
this
boring.
idea.
Yeah, like you said.
What
Yeah.
was that?
Or it could be boring, like you were saying, like, it might just be like, what would it mean to look at undifferentiated anything? Matter or
A
info
soup
or
of forks at the
yeah, right,
what is that?
right.
Interesting is that? I
Yeah,
don't you know what I mean? Like,
it's a really good point.
and I think even just the attempt to conceptualize it, like, how would I'm gonna take a bit of like a, human humility point on this, right? We
Yeah,
occupy a limited perspective on reality. You could speculate about it, but I
sure.
don't wanna ever claim to know, right?
Yeah,
Like, in
yeah,
that sense of like, this is what it is, like,
yeah,
um, and so, the fundamental freaks me out, but I think it's always freaked out anybody that, like, does metaphysics of mind or consciousness, particularly this kind of question, right? It's
yeah,
always that question, like,
yeah.
what's at the fundamental level? Russell was just like, I don't know, quiddities? What,
Yeah, I can
you know
get
what I
that.
mean?
Yeah.
I
I like
don't know.
I
Like,
liked some
it's like,
quiddities in my life. I like that for sure. In the
I'm happy.
Ontic structural realism, I hear that sometimes from like some certain types of hylomorphists will go in like real hard on like the
Mhm,
structure and they go structure all the way down. I'm thinking when it comes to the hard problem of consciousness, it's like, hey, look, how do we get phenomenal facts from physical facts, or
mhm,
qualia from physical things? How, it seems weird. It seems crazy. There's an explanatory gap. um,
yeah,
so I go in for substance dualism for a lot of the same reasons that Goff goes in for panpsychism. It's like, yeah, I know
mhm,
it's weird. I know it sounds unscientific, and there's the common or interaction problem, sure, but at least I don't have the hard problem, right? I'm
mhm,
wondering if the hard problem, if you can just sidestep it with a like information theoretic explanation and say like you don't get consciousness from physical things because you have this third thing, this neutral monist view.
mhm.
So one question is just that is that the move? And then two, like, does the hard problem just follow over into the neutral monist view and say, well, okay, well, how do you get consciousness from information then?
Yeah. So, yeah, so it's a great question. It's kind of how my dissertation started. Actually, my PhD
Sweet.
dissertation, I gave what I called the hard problem of information. So I was like, okay, let's take integrated information theory. Let's see how the hard problem matches up to it. Basically, like, look, if we take a strong stance on the nature of information as like this distinct ontological or metaphysical category, right? Has an existence on its own, separate from the physical. Well, then we actually just get a new hard problem,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I tried to pull from Chalmers' own work, right? In Conscious Mind in his 96 book, right? He ends with a kind of speculative chapter. And I've never griped at him about this, but I always want to. He's never followed on that. And I kind of feel a little let down. I hope if he watches this, I want more information stuff, right?
Yeah,
His new books kind of touches on it a little bit, but I wanted more, right? But this idea of like, is this dual aspect notion of information. Maybe this is connected up to how, physical reality and the phenomenal interact. But ultimately, I think you get a new problem, right? You get this hard problem of information, which is just why is it the case that phenomenal experience or properties are entailed by information theoretic reality, right? Well,
yeah.
you get the same thing just in information terms. The thing is, I think it leaves enough wiggle room. And this was another essay that I published from the dissertation on, you have the hard problem of consciousness, right? Which is this
Mhm.
question of, well, what is the entailment of physical experience, or sorry, phenomenal experience and properties from the physical, right? This is entailment question.
Yeah,
Behind the hard problem, though, is you have what might be called the master argument, right? So Stoljar calls it. The master argument is the structure and dynamics argument, right? And that's a comment about what it is that the physical is composed of, right? And that's when Chalmers talks about things like structure and function or structure and dynamics, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the type of explanations that physical explanation give. Those are what's lacking that we don't get the entailment from. And so what I do is I kind of ask, well, does Chalmers actually give an exhaustive definition of structure and dynamics? If structure and dynamics is what composes what the physical is telling us, right? Is that an exhaustive definition? And pulling from a few different areas, particularly some work done by Kolchinsky and Wolpert, Santa Fe Institute in the
Okay.
complexity science. They were doing work on, sorry, some nonlinear dynamics in terms of like how do we get semantics from the syntax of nature, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
where does meaning and value come from? How do you give a physical explanation of that, right? And they were doing some stuff on non-equilibrium and thermodynamics to try to explain how we extract meaning by the difference between our, the way that the syntax of nature is, between that and our expectations of it, how we go out and I think of like food seeking behavior, like, right? How we get meaning from reality. Right.
Yeah.
I took that and then I took some of the stuff from IET, which had this idea of, again, still this kind of idea of like, is there something kind of qualitatively different about the structure and dynamics of sort of uh, naturally occurring complex systems, which aren't captured in Chalmers' characterization of it? And I
Yeah.
kind of come to a similar conclusion to people that I get IET is that there's a kind of difference between extrinsic and intrinsic structure and dynamics. You might think extrinsic structure and dynamics or structure and functions are the things that are readily observable from the outside, right? Third
Okay.
person observable.
Yeah.
So you might think if you have a kind of billiard ball view about how physical things interact with each other, right?
Yeah.
It's all the stuff that bumps into each other that we can look at, right?
Hmm.
But then if you think about the kind of intrinsic structure and dynamics that might be going on, maybe if you think about the kind of self-organization of like a locust swarm, is that captured by Chalmers' notion of structure and function or structure and dynamics? But you might think of even more complex than that, right? You might think
Mm.
of the integrated information, say that IET posits in the posterior cortex, right? These sort of intrinsic structure and dynamical properties that only arise with a very particular satisfaction of, say, those axioms and the postulates given by IET, that kind of intrinsic structure and dynamics, it's not clear to me that that's actually captured in this notion of
Mm.
structure and function that Chalmers gives.
Yeah.
And I think what that does is opens up enough of a door, right? Just cracks the door open. Like, well, there could be a class of structural and dynamical properties, very specific ones, that might be able to get us around the hard problem, right? And,
Okay.
and they say the only explanation that's kind of amenable to that is this sort of information theoretic, kind of ontic structuralist explanation. Um, Particularly if we take a much more hardline position on, say, the metaphysics and ontology of information, which again just sounds kind of wild, right? But like you said, if it does better work,
Right.
I'm gonna take it, right?
It's
Like,
all wild. Yeah.
it's all wild. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
the moment you speculate about the ultimate nature of reality, like, I don't know, you're off to the races. There's no
Right.
there's no hold back. Like,
Right.
you might as well just go
Yeah.
for
I love that, man.
it.
Well, so something I've come to notice in studying philosophy of mind is like I'm going super deep into film mind stuff, and then
Mhm,
I talk to someone who's really deep into consciousness, and it's like, oh, dude, we're actually like, speaking past each other, even though I
mhm,
thought we were talking about the same stuff. But there's the science of consciousness, there's different theories of consciousness, and they may not be trying to pick out the metaphysics going on, and that's okay.
mhm.
It's just different fields and stuff, but it's really fascinating that you get into the metaphysics as well. Do you have a particular theory of mind that you're attracted to?
Like, in terms of, like, science of consciousness or
No, like just like theories of mind, like emergence, or like probably not substance dualism or panpsychism, like
ah,
yeah, anything in that realm. Yeah, see,
see
like
what you're
it can be so it's such a broad topic, which is funny, but
yeah, yeah, so, yeah. Yes. So, I would say I have ones I like more and ones I like less,
okay,
right?
sure,
You probably know, given some of the stuff, disparaging comments are made about physicalism. I'm not a huge fan of physicalism, right?
nice,
Mainly because I think it's relatively I don't make uninformative. It seems wholly uninformative in
wow,
terms of what the actual nature of reality is, right?
yeah,
Particularly convinced by kind of the issue, not only the hard problem, but issues like gap arguments, like
hmm,
explanatory gap, these types of things. But even just like Hempel's dilemma, right? Like I
yeah.
brought it up already. This idea of like it's either just false patently right now because our physical explanation is not complete, or it's just vacuously true because future physics will figure it out.
Whenever that
I
is,
just
they'll tell us. Yeah, right,
tell us. I just think, well, that doesn't really help us now. Or it doesn't really tell me anything other than reality is what it is. And you go, well, I already accepted the law of identity, so it doesn't tell me anything, right? I
right.
want to move past that. I want to try to, and so I think looking at these problem cases make it more revealing. So that's probably my least favorite, right? And so I'm very sympathetic to views like Strawson and sort of Phillips, even, right, and Chalmers.
Okay.
Um, I was originally panpsych is what I was interested in, right? That's why I wanted to work with Philip Goff. I was interested in it. Eventually, I kind of I became disenchanted because it felt like uh, we were just replacing the mystery with the phenomenal, right? So,
Yeah.
well, I don't know what the category nature. I'll put the phenomenal down there, and it does some work, but then it leads to all kinds of other what to me seem like pressing, like practical questions that are left unanswered, right? So you might think like, a combination problem for
Yep.
panpsychism. How do a bunch of little minds become bigger minds? To me, it was lacking like the kind of meat, right? So one of the reasons I got into philosophy was I was very interested in physics and some of these questions, right? And so, in some extent, it sounds kind of weird. I feel like our metaphysics should line up with maybe some of the best work that's going on in the natural sciences.
Mm,
Physics has always felt kind of lacking because it didn't have this explanation about, in a way, how does it actually happen? Like, what's the like how? Like, it gives me the why, which was the big question. It couldn't answer with the hard problem, but it completely leaves me out of the how. Right now, you could combine that, right? Take someone like Christoph Koch, right? He takes IET and panpsychism and kind of marries them, right? Has this sort of panpsychist view about IET.
yeah.
That's a way to do it. I just kind of wanted to do something a little bit different. So I like panpsychism. I like Brazilian monism. That was my next kind of
Okay.
flirtation with. Ultimately, I ended up on neutral monism mainly for this question of like, I want the nature of reality to do some work. And so I need to find some positive conception about that neutral element that does work,
Yeah.
right? And to some extent, right, there's the vague sense in which every single scientific discipline uses the concept of information, right? You find it in biology, people talk about the information contained in DNA. You talk about it in physics, right? When you talk about the information contained in physical interactions, right? Like how
Yeah.
Wheeler talked about. You find the notion of information in all these different ways. You particularly find it in the context of the mind and consciousness. So I'm going to go, well, here's a concept that transcends all the usual physical mental dichotomy. And for some reason, we're just ignoring it as a possible like metaphysical, ontological. But why?
Yeah.
Like, what is that?
Right.
It's just like, to me, it's like a failure of imagination. Is that it? Like, it's just like, it seems bizarre. So let's not do it. And so neutral monism I finally landed on because I was like, okay, here's a space where you can maybe try a new thing, like a new
Yep.
ingredient to reality to try to make sense of it. So ultimately, if I had to pick a theory of mind, I'm going to be neutral monist
Okay.
being. Yeah.
Neutral monist with yeah, so and that neutral thing is information. Um,
Yes.
what do you do with, like, this is, like, probably, philosophy 101, but it sounds like you're teaching a intro class anyways.
Yeah.
Like, what would you say you are? Like, yeah, what is Garrett? And, like, how do you survive over time where you're gaining and maybe losing information, right? Like,
Mhm.
is there a
Yeah. Yeah.
center, is there, like, a certain amount of and I know this is all speculation, right? Like, so
Yeah.
totally,
Yeah.
like, we're out there, but is there like a core element of a core, set of information that constitutes you that does survive over time? Or maybe you think that you don't survive over time?
It's a great question. I think anything I comment on this will be a little kind of from the hip,
Sure,
which
sure,
hopefully is
yeah.
like,
Yeah,
I mean, it's not that I haven't thought about this, just I don't know if I have a real coherent explanation of it.
yeah,
In some sense, right? If I'm kind of committing myself to this idea of like, what really exists in reality is structure.
yeah.
Those structures
Oh, yeah.
exist over time, right? And to some
Mhm.
extent, as those structures evolve dynamically over time, there is sort of a kind of pattern, right, that might emerge. So I have kind of thought about like, well, what is, is that the self? Is the self just the kind of the set that contains all of the patterns that have ever, dynamically evolved, right?
Yeah,
Each time step. And then it gets into theories about like what the nature of time is, presentist, et cetera. But I think for this purposes of kind of like that question, right? Who is Garrett? First off, I've never had a good explanation about who I am. I
yeah.
think anyone who goes into philosophy, I think that's like a big motivator, right? It's like,
Right, yeah.
wow, who am I? Does any of this matter? You know what I mean? Like, might as well talk about consciousness. It's just
Yeah.
that. So that's who I am, right? But then the question of like metaphysically or ontologically, who is Garrett Mintz, right?
Mm,
In some sense, it sounds a little strange, right? But I would say I am, say, whatever pattern has persisted long enough in this structure of information over time.
Uh,
And that structure exists at all kinds of scales and levels of organization, right?
yeah,
So,
right.
like, there is, in some sense, a set of descriptions, right, at various temporal grains, which would satisfy information theoretic structural explanation of Garrett.
Yeah,
That's weird to think about, right? But in some ways, it's also kind of not. It's kind of the way we think about it normally, right? Say if I
sure.
was a physicalist and so, the collection of bits of matter that persistently follow me around, right? And
Yeah,
then some explanation about the continuity of the mind related to that, et cetera. And so I think it's not too dissimilar to that. It just takes a little bit more maybe footwork and trying to make sense of that.
yeah,
And I also think it's really nice because it actually kind of gives us like a way of explaining why, you know, as I dynamically evolve over time, or the structure changes over time, right? Maybe I lose and gain information, which is totally true, right? Like
right.
there was a kind of childlike innocence that I slowly lost as I got older. And so you could say, and maybe the information that I give off changed over time, right? Like,
Yeah,
people saw me as a child, and maybe perhaps I was a little more naive, and that I became a jaded older philosopher, and I gave off different types of information, right? Or
yeah,
I expressed myself differently. In some ways, like we conceptualize reality in this way, right? The way that we communicate or we organize our thoughts about it, right? Like
yeah,
even the we're doing this podcast, right? This is a kind of information theoretic exchange. We are forming a unique pattern that
yeah,
didn't
man.
exist in, right?
Yeah.
So when you think about it, not to get too hippie on everything,
This is
it's all
so
connected.
good. I love it. That's why I love Phil Mind stuff because you can kind of get stonery or hippie or whatever. Um,
Well, I was so interested in we're gonna do stoner philosophy. It was
it's the
like what
best.
space and time and
Yeah, yeah,
consciousness. Like, these are the kind of questions. It's like, and there's a reason why they come up in these contexts. Like,
totally.
we don't get a lot of space. I think it's like you tell them too, right? It's like here's your one opportunity for 16 weeks to just think about questions that you never really get a chance to just talk about. Take
Yeah,
advantage of it, right?
yeah.
Like, and I feel blessed to have a career where I just get to talk about consciousness. So,
So awesome. I love that.
picture of reality. But
Yeah. Do you think here's another stoner question for you. So if I could mm, like scan your structure at all the
Mhm,
different levels that you exist in, and I could 3D print that structure, do you think
mhm.
that you are multiply realizable if I could 3D print your structure? Would it have like would it be you, or do we need like the historical condition that this you are the same structure that was that naive child before?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I mean, now I feel like I'm gonna cry. No, no, go back to those innocent days, halcyon days. Um, no, I think largely I'm sort of largely or broadly at this point in time, I think I'm committed to saying, yes, that is
Okay.
you for all intents and purposes,
Yeah.
right? If you're looking for something more, you're not going to get it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I think I am kind of committed to that, right? Like an absolutely perfect informational isomorph in that sense
Yeah.
would be cool for all intents and purposes.
Okay.
Now we can ask a different question, right? Which is more like you said, like, well, it doesn't have the historicity of this particular system as it evolved over time. And I think that's true, right? It doesn't have that causal chain.
Right.
So you might be able to say there might be a little bit of an escape there. It'd be nice, right?
Sure.
To say like, but to some extent, I don't know if I have qualms about it, right? I always think about like what Will Riker, is it Thomas Peake, his like clone in Star Trek. Do you know Star Trek Next Generation?
I don't know Next Gen that much. I don't know names that well, but I know the stories and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Will Riker goes in the transporter, a duplicate gets made, right?
Hmm.
Since other than him, for all intents and purposes, right? And who's who, right? Who's Will Riker,
Yeah.
right? Historicity question, or his historical or the causal chain that led to Will Riker going into the transport. That one's that, right? And then the
Yeah.
new one, although it's a duplicate, right? It started its own causal chain the moment it materialized. It's a separate entity in that sense. There could be wiggle room there.
Yeah.
I'm okay not being unique. I don't know. It's okay. If you just copied me a million times, I don't think I'd have any qualms about it,
Yeah.
right? Just gonna keep it going.
Yeah.
But I think I am committed to that.
Okay.
If ultimately I think the only thing that differentiates us is our structure and organization, that identical, say numerically identical informational isomorphs in that sense, they would be the same as me, right?
Yeah.
On a kind of metaphysical, ontological level.
Yeah.
Other considerations might differentiate us, but yeah.
Yeah. You just add in a historical condition and say like, well, that's the real one, though the one that survived or has been around longer or something, or was the same one. Yeah. That's
Yeah,
cool. That
exactly.
makes
Yeah.
sense. That's actually a fascinating way of thinking about the transporter. That they're sucking you down to your information and putting your information somewhere else, and that's why Yeah, that's not
Hey, look,
bad.
if it's good enough for Star Trek, it's good enough for my physics and ontology, right?
That's right. That's
In
right.
some ways, yeah, we do conceptualize it that way. Or anytime, I mean, I think anytime you think about, well, whenever they talk about, the universe being computational,
Yeah.
you know, these types of things, like I kind of think, well, yeah, the best way to make sense of some of these things is to have this sort of information theoretic picture of reality.
Mhm.
Like, and I think it captures better some of these things that perhaps other views just don't quite capture.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Well, I think that's a
I,
really fascinating point because, when I was at Mindfest and I was talking with a lot of the AI theorist folks and, some of the physicist type folks, like, they really
mhm,
go hard for computational stuff, like, they're all
mhm,
about it, and I was talking with some of the undergrads and grad students, they're like, "Yeah, it's just computations all the way down." And I think it's
yeah,
fascinating that you're in both worlds, and so you're picking this view that can make sense ontologically over with the philosophers, but then also can help make sense of some of the AI theorists and the computational stuff. So it is nice to have a neutral monism, which can do some explanatory work on both sides. I think that's pretty fascinating.
yeah. Thanks. I mean, that's kind of the point, right? Like, I don't know, maybe it's just a way for me to feel less torn between two worlds. But
Mm,
I always find myself like a philosopher, like in kind of more science settings, right? So we have
yeah,
the Center for the Future Mind. There's a lot of AI people in there. We share a space with machine perception and cognitive robotics lab. So there's always this kind of interchange of ideas. It can be a little jarring to be a philosopher that's been talking to scientists, right? For one, engineers just do not care about philosophical questions.
it's like the way
For
they're
the most,
made, right? They're just I'm
yeah,
totally
like,
with you. They're like, who cares? So what? Let's do the practical work. I'm like, no, talk. Let's talk more. Yeah,
yeah, it's always surprising to me. That's not to say that they don't get interested in it, right? You
right,
just got to
right.
find the right paths.
That's
And
right.
to me, that's always like kind of fun, right? It's like, okay, how do I get an engineer who does not care about, these kind of really abstract metaphysical, ontological, how do I get them to care about theories of causation?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
some of the broader picture maybe doesn't have any practical application for the code they're literally trying to write,
sure.
but just gets interested in it and realizes like, oh, this actually has an impact on, say I wanted to characterize how a theory, or say AI does causal reasoning, right? Well, in some sense, then it's really helpful to know different theories of causation, right? So you
Right.
find avenues. And there are always these really cool connections. I mean, that's what I loved about spending a couple of years in Wisconsin, right? With like neuroscientists and physicists, mathematicians. The conversations were always varied. Philosophy is the unifying theme there,
Yeah.
right? Because, and I always think that's really cool when people kind of have this like, oh, like that's why philosophers are still around. It's like this. It doesn't make sense that we still exist, but we do, and there's a
Right.
reason, right? There's this. It's the common thread, right? Like anytime you want to talk about some of these bigger questions, for better or worse, and much to the chagrin of many scientists, philosophers pop up. Like
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah,
I
that's
don't know.
right.
It's like,
I
yeah,
love
like
that.
like
I'm 100% with you. Yeah, this is so good. Well, so you are at the Center for the Future Mind, and there are AI folks all up in there. One thing that I found over the past weekend was the strong distinction between intelligence and consciousness, which gets taken for
mhm,
granted in a lot of the philosophical conversations I have. In the metaphysics side of philosophy of mind, where it's like we everyone over there kind of assumes when you're talking about AGI, you're talking about a conscious robot or a conscious machine, and then you go over to the other side, and they're like, oh no, I don't. AGI doesn't have to be conscious. You can have
mhm.
intelligence without consciousness and such like that. So I wanted to pick your brain on that. Do you think that you can have intelligence without consciousness?
The short answer, yes.
Okay.
The long answer is much more complicated, and a little more interesting, right? So, I think you can have intelligent systems that aren't conscious, and you have conscious systems that aren't particularly intelligent,
Hmm.
right? To borrow kind of phrasing from IT as a kind of strong position on it, they think that intelligence and consciousness is doubly dissociated, which means there's just really no connection between the two.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if I have that strong of a position, right? This double dissociated view, but I do think they pull apart uh, to a large extent quite a bit,
Yeah.
but for really important reasons in a way. And so I've done a little bit of work on this question about AGI and its relationship to consciousness,
Yeah.
and so I have a kind of where I one I want to make distinction between something like phenomenal consciousness and access
Yep.
consciousness, right? Which people have heard ad nauseum, but I'll do it real quick just in case anybody hasn't, right?
Yep. Sure.
The phenomenal consciousness is sort of like what it is like to experience the world, right? It's like a subjective, qualitative aspect of experience, right? So if you want to explain phenomenal consciousness, that what it's like of experience, that would be the type of consciousness you're talking about. But then you might think about access consciousness, right? Which is the ability for us to access our internal states, right? So the
Yeah.
ability for me to access my own thoughts or cognitions about the world, right? You might even lump certain perceptions into there, right? My emotional states, affective states, right? So our ability to access those states, let me access. Now you might think that for the question of like artificial general intelligence, right? So if we're thinking of like AIs which have achieved at least human-like level of intelligence, right? Maybe in
Mhm.
terms of capability, like how generalized its intelligence is. Like I can learn things about riding a bicycle, which I can then transfer to a different knowledge domain, right? So if I'm generalizing that intelligence, right? You might think access consciousness might be necessary for that, right?
Yeah.
Actually, Carlos Montemayor and I have co-written a paper on this question, particularly in the context of like uh, AI epistemology. It's like knowledge generated by AI.
Yeah.
We kind of put things in terms of the question of like cognitive control. So you might think a mark of something reaching AGI is that it has the kind of cognitive control that we would normally associate with a system that produces knowledge, right? So like you and I have the kind of cognitive control or cognitive agency to systematically think through a topic and
Yeah.
generate some kind of conclusion or inference or outcome. You might think a similar thing might be required for AGI, in which case access might be a requirement of um, artificial general intelligence.
Mhm.
I can see scenarios where that's not the case, right? So, like, I think maybe that's a real clear way of getting towards AGI is, create knowledge-based systems, right? And
Yeah.
this isn't like a new thing. A lot of people have talked about this for a long time. Um, but you might create a system that's a purely phenomenal creature, right? Just has nothing but experiences, but very few thoughts about that experience, right? Or it
Yeah.
doesn't cognize about it, doesn't access its states about it. It just either lives in a pure state of bliss or suffering or, maybe a mix of the 2, but it just experience.
That
I
could
think
be
that
really
seems like
bad.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
for the better or worse. I mean,
Yeah,
hopefully
right.
we're not creating, you know,
Just pure
entities of
pain.
infinite but
Right.
yeah, exactly. That's a little bit of a horrifying scenario, right?
Mhm.
But I think it's one of the reasons why we should kinda be cautious about this question of, like, I don't know, how sophisticated we wanna make these systems, right?
Yeah.
The point is we already like, we're getting better at it. It's a rather young field, right? Science of consciousness or these types of topics of creating artificial minds or intelligent, right? It's relatively young in some ways, and there's a lot of ethical implications if we achieve really high bars of success in these areas,
Yeah.
right? Because we don't want to be, say, creating like we just talked about, right? An entity that only is phenomenally conscious. We don't know it is, right? Because we don't know how to detect consciousness for the most part, right?
Yeah.
In a lot of systems, which I'm sure we might talk about, right? But and then we create this being of infinite suffering, but we have no way of that seems like a horrifying
Horrible.
scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry to bring it up. I hope I haven't
Yeah.
depressed your viewing. But
Yeah.
yeah, hey, hopefully we're not doing it.
Right.
So I think it's important to ask the question about this question about does intelligence and consciousness, do they detach? Are they related?
Hmm.
I think they can be related, but then it's maybe not necessary for it to be.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, so it's a tricky question.
Well, so, do you again, just, random opinion type stuff. Do you think dogs have, like, excess consciousness?
Um, I think they're conscious, right?
Yeah.
I think they're phenomenally conscious. I I'd be hesitant, right, if I'm saying access consciousness in the way that we have cognitive control of our states.
Right.
I don't know if we can. I think a lot of animals do, though, right?
Hmm.
Uh, like dogs, probably, yeah.
Okay.
I'd be cool.
Nice.
I guess one way to think about it is it doesn't really impact me whether I do it or not, right?
Yeah.
If they're having complex cognitive, as they're doing it complex, I'm cool with that, right? But crows, octopuses, all kinds of animals do, right? And I'm
Yeah.
totally comfortable with that. One, I'm not denying that they have phenomenal experience, and if they have access consciousness, right? I think another thing that we always need to be considered, right, is we're always picturing this from the human perspective, right?
Yeah.
Kind of anthropomorphic perspective. And we always think like, oh, admitting systems have these types of states is admitting they have them just like us.
Yeah.
And I don't
Right.
know, true, right? I am more than comfortable to say that, a significant portion of the animal kingdom has a much more complex mental life than we've historically given them credit for,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I'm really sympathetic to IIT, which means I think an incredible amount of systems in the universe have integrated information, which means they have an intrinsic existence, which means they have an experience than a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm a little comfortable with that. I'm kind of like a let a thousand flowers bloom when it
Sure.
comes to the ontology of the ontological existence in terms of consciousness. Have at it.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I'm
I
with
mean
you.
it.
I've
Yeah, and then it becomes the tricky thing of, like, how do we accommodate then that into how we practice our lives? And it
right.
brings in this ethical dimension I think is really important, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think the ethics are a whole another issue where I think it is important to make that distinction between intelligence and consciousness, especially for
Mhm.
grounding like moral status. Like I think we probably should ground it
Yep.
more in consciousness than in intelligence, because then
Mhm.
we get to have infants and children and dogs and all sorts of other things that look they don't looks like they don't have the same intelligence as us, but that doesn't mean that they're lacking in moral status because it seems like the phenomenal consciousness is what matters a lot to suffering
Yeah.
and
Yeah, big time. And I think, like, um, I guess in some sense too, I'm always more willing to let in maybe members that shouldn't have been let in for
yeah,
whatever reason
yeah,
and excluding ones that should have,
yeah,
right? And I always think always err on the side of too many things have moral deference than not enough.
yeah,
Like it for me, I just think, okay, that just maybe is a better way to avoid terrible situations, right? Where
mm,
you're you're not giving moral deference to creatures that you should have.
yeah,
Well, then just admit more into your picture about the world, and that'll cover any of the cases that definitely should be admitted. But maybe you get a couple that aren't, right? Like
yeah,
what we acted more morally on the whole than we would have
yeah,
otherwise.
oops,
I
yeah,
like whoops. Like,
right,
yeah,
yeah,
you're too good a person or too good of an actor in the universe. Like I
yeah,
think, that's like when it comes to these kind of questions, I'm right, and I try to bring this out in the title of my talk, right? We always talk about, like, the borderline of consciousness. Like, where should we draw the line so that we can say, "Yes, conscious, moral deference. No, not conscious, no moral deference." And I actually don't think it's a line. I think it's this borderlands, right?
yeah,
It's just a huge area, and just say, "Yes, those entities should have moral deference." Why? Because we've accepted with this human humility our limited perspective and ability to or, explain the world, right? Or know the world. So let's just admit the borderlands, right? These all things should have moral deference. We should think about them very closely. But why are we trying to exclude them under the no of the line? Like to me, I don't see the point, right?
yeah. Well, so yeah,
The
I'm with
dogs
you.
or maybe even past the borderlands, right? Like
Yeah.
I got a soft spot for dogs, so I'm totally happy for them to.
Me too. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, I always have to bring up my dog Theophilus because he's like the unofficial Parker's Pensées mascot because
Uh,
he always photobombs. He's over here sleeping, thankfully, not
oh,
eating my
nice.
today. Today. But,
Usually the effect on when I talk. So my intro class, everyone's so.
that's awesome. Um, well, we had this great conversation at dinner one of the nights, and we were talking just about the same thing about like, people who have locked in syndrome and this stuff. I'm even like scared to talk about because it's like, one of the worst nightmares of being locked in, not being able to let anyone know that you are conscious. Um, and we had the same discussion of like, hey, err on the side of it being conscious
Mhm.
imagine yourself in that situation, and it's like, err on the side of like, "Oops, we let in this guy who was actually brain dead, because we thought there's a potential that he could be locked in, and so we treated him with dignity, instead of treating him like he was brain dead and just doing whatever to him."
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and sorry if that was a depressing conversation that we had. I think we did it like it was like the night before everything
It
started.
was
We were
really
like, "Wow, it's not
fascinating, but yeah, yeah, yeah.
let's have a fun time tomorrow." Yeah.
Mhm.
No, it is this kind of right, really, really tragic and really uh, kind of scary scenario to think about, right?
Yeah.
This kind of situation of being locked in or in a minimally conscious state or any disorder of consciousness, really, right? And
Mhm.
in some sense, one, it highlights the kind of like moral and ethical imperative that we have to really work on the science of consciousness, right? Which
Yeah.
sounds strange, right? Because we're like, why does it matter if we understand where experience comes from or these kinds of things, right? But it has huge implications for these types of questions, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm pretty sure families of patients in a minimal state of consciousness are locked into they hope that there is more dedicated research being done
Yeah.
on coming to terms and having a better way of identifying or being able to treat these types of disorders. Um, and then just in the question of like you said too, like being able to detect, right? And in some sense, for me, the impetus isn't so much finding a way to detect so we can make that the borderlands into a line and make it
Oh,
as thin
yeah.
as possible.
Right.
Right. In the sense of like, I don't know if we should ever try to collapse the borderlands. I'm happy to keep it thick.
Okay.
We just admit more entities in and we exist in that gray space. I'm happy with that. Maybe that's because my own life is a bit of a gray space. And so I'm comfortable with gray space.
Hmm.
But get rid of the line idea. Why do we need that? No, we just have this area. We've just admitted as many people as we could, any entity that which we think has like this presumption of similarity to us, right? Um, I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
But we still have the imperative to know better one, how to detect states of consciousness in entities, right? So we can treat better, right? And I think that's like the big imperative for all these people, right? Particularly in the science of consciousness. A lot of people that I talk to, right, they're neurologists. They work on things maybe like epilepsy, or they work on, horrible situations of like locked in or minimal states of consciousness, various disorders of consciousness, right? There is a sense of a very strong moral and ethical imperative to help people that fall into this state. And in some sense, even for their families, right? Or families or friends or loved ones that, uh, in some sense, the knowledge of whether or not they are there, they can hear, right? Bring some comfort to those people that are related to them, right? Or
Yeah.
in connection to and so I think we do have a kind of ethical, imperative to understand consciousness better.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to touch on mini brains as well, because that was part of your talk. Cerebral organoids. Can you just broach that for us, and we can kind of wave it as we keep going on?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, we can end with all the things that began this conversation. So, yeah, so the talk with, you it was a panel that was dealt with infant consciousness, animal consciousness, and the question of sort of like these borderlands. The one I picked for this borderlands was cerebral organoids. So cerebral organoids are neural structures grown from human stem cells, right? Which maybe reflect a particular structure of the brain that you want to study, right? But and you might think of them as mini brains or maybe like petri dish brains, right? They are grown in a growth medium to reflect some neural structure, right? In some sense, why I wanted to bring up organoids, not only because I think there's something, right? There's an incredibly there's incredibly useful practical application for these things, right? You can use them to study like neurodegenerative diseases, right? Where you need the live structure to be able to test on,
Yeah.
right? You need to know the structural features, say, of the hippocampus for something like maybe like Alzheimer's, right? It's a big application for organoids.
Oh yeah.
Remember this question of like full cerebral organoids, right? Where you're creating like three-dimensional structures, brain, right? It starts bringing up this question about, well, like, to how far do we go before we give the same kind of deference to that system that we would normally give to a system that has a human brain, right? There's this kind of question of like, and again, that's why I wanted to like the borderlands. I wanted this thick
Thick.
line where it's
Yeah.
like, just admit it until we know better, right? Err on the side of caution. To me, it's interesting because, sometimes we kind of have what I call the presumption of similarity, right?
Yeah.
So you and I have the presumption of similarity of we are both, members of the same species. We have very similar neurological structure and organization, et cetera. So I assume that a lot of the states that go on to me happen in you.
Yeah.
We also have that presumption of similarity, say, with like other organisms, right? Like we talk about dogs, we talk about other animals, right? And then we start losing this presumption of similarity. Now, the cerebral organoid case is kind of interesting, right? Because it's a scaled down version of the kind of neural structure that we usually have extreme deference towards, right?
Hmm.
The human, right? Because I know what it's like to be human and I extrapolate that that's what it's like for everybody else to be human. And I'm not a soul obsessed, right? I don't think I've created everybody
That's
with
good.
my imagination.
Yeah.
I have some thin grasp on reality still. But when it comes to the question of cerebral organoids, right? Where is the point where these become sufficiently complex mini brains, quote unquote, that this presumption of similarity takes over and we should have the same kind of moral difference that I would in a normal human case, right?
Right.
Or we know very little about when, maybe not very little, but depending on what theory of consciousness you ascribe to, right? That cerebral organoid may very quickly gain the type of structure and organization at which consciousness comes about, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes we should be a little careful, not necessarily like stop doing it completely, right? Pump the brakes, right? But we should, in some ways, be very cognizant, right, of when we might be crossing out of the borderlands, right, and maybe into more like, oh well, Sam, I think IT is the best science of consciousness theory. Well, if that system has a sufficient level of integration and differentiation, and it has a level of what IT calls phi, right, integrated information,
Yeah.
well, that organoid is for all intents and purposes conscious. It has experience. What the nature of that experience is like, you know what I mean? What the consciousness is, maybe how sophisticated it is. That's a different question, right?
Yeah.
But it does have it. It has that intrinsic existence, that intrinsic experience. But say I'm something like global workspace, right? Global workspace theory, where I think you need a prefrontal cortex. That's where consciousness happens,
Right.
right? And these cerebral organoids don't have that, right? It's going to be a long time until we grow a kind of fully matured adult, cerebral organoid. But maybe I don't worry too much about it.
Hmm.
But again, take this argument that I talked about, where it's make the line thick,
Yeah.
admit as many instances as you can. You might think there are actually prevailing moral and ethical reasons to go with something like IT, which would admit a lot of systems into your picture of reality, but also put you in a position where you're not admitting too little, right? So
Yeah.
there might be. prevailing ethical reasons why you think adopting something like IT is beneficial, right?
I can imagine, Dr. Goff coming through and saying, "Well, that's why, that's why we need to go full panpsychism because it'll let in even more
Mhm.
entities into that realm." That's a thick, thick line. Um,
Well, then it's just like, but your line becomes so thick it just becomes paper. I don't know.
there's
I
no
don't know if
more.
it's still a line, right?
That's a
Like,
good point. Yeah.
yeah, to
Yeah,
do the
sorry.
metaphysics of lines, there's probably someone better qualified. That's
So good.
yeah.
I love that. Um, so continuing on with, Ontic structural realism,
Mhm,
yeah, you might even say like, well, look, it doesn't have the same structure as it's not like an isomorph of the mind, but you could still go like, look, we're just creating a pain, a being that only experiences pain. So still, we can still use caution, all sorts of stuff. Like, even
um,
if it doesn't fit, if we're a global workspace, yeah, go with like one that does let in more, just in
mhm,
case, because we could, maybe exercise some intellectual humility here and say like, maybe I don't have the exact right theory of consciousness, but I want to be cautious. That's cool. Um,
yeah,
when it comes to making conscious robots or conscious machines, artificial general
mhm,
intelligence that has phenomenal consciousness, do you does Ontic structural realism or information theoretic explanations, does that predict that we'll have to make isomorphs of the human brain, or could there be a different structure that realizes phenomenal consciousness in machines
mhm.
or something like that, computers?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so much of the position that there's only one route to these types of things,
Okay.
right? So I think kinda came out with, like, Ben Goertzel's thinking on this.
Yeah.
I'm very sympathetic to the way that Ben Goertzel thinks about these things,
Okay.
right? Uh, I'm really hesitant to say there's only one way that these things will ever get achieved, right?
Yeah.
There's a sense in which you can differentiate 2 things, right? So, if and the question about machine consciousness, right? You know, maybe there is kind of like one way that phenomenal consciousness comes about, maybe there is like a theory that explains how phenomenal experience comes about. But we
Yeah.
might have functionally isomorphic conscious systems, right? Which are systems that behave so well that functionally, right, in terms of the functional consciousness, they're basically just like as good as us, right?
Yeah.
And so you might think there's a difference there, right? And there's all kinds of systems that might satisfy that constraint, right? So if we just want systems that behave and report and function as if they were conscious, there's tons of ways that might happen,
Yeah.
right? And anything I speculate there, or anything I say, would be purely speculative, right?
Right.
If I had a way to make a functionally conscious system, I would not be on this podcast right now. I'd be in Barbados on our islands.
That's right.
I right? Like, I would have my AI super compound in Norway. But you know what I mean? Like, that system hasn't been created yet, right?
Yeah.
So whenever someone's like, "Oh, yeah, of course, like, we're gonna crack machine conscious," it's like, if it was that easy, it would have happened, right? So this inevitability I just never understood, right?
Hmm.
Oh, I just not getting the right code. Like, I don't know if that's the problem. Like, I think the problem is, right, Howard conceptual, which is why I find Ben Goertzel's approach really interesting, right? Is he's looking for innovative ways to combine various approaches into each other, right? To maybe kind of create the sort of like the kind of, messy way that our own brain came about, right?
Yeah.
And it's not sort of similar because, he's done A-life research before and stuff. But I think, there's many paths that might happen for that, particularly when it comes to like functional, like the way we think about conscious in terms of its function. Phenomenal conscious, I think, is a very different story. I mean, you might think one, if you take something like IT, you're immediately going to run into the problem of hardware constraint or just pure constraints on computation,
Yeah.
right? So one of the things that's a problem with IT is that, the moment you start integrating things, you start getting this kind of combinatorial explosion issue, right? Where the computation becomes so impracticable that, we wouldn't want to do it on a normal computer until the heat death of the universe, right? It's not really interesting to us. We could do it. It could be a fun time capsule for infinity, but who wants to do those computations right
Right.
now, right? And so you have to look at approximations and workarounds. And so there's a question about, well, do we have to create a perfect isomorph of our brain to create? Now, the question of to create my experience, you have to create an isomorph. Yes, right.
Yeah.
You'd have to, according to this kind of information theoretic view, to create a system that has human consciousness. Maybe you don't need to create a perfect isomorph, but something that has the right structure and organization.
Yeah.
Create a system that has consciousness is a separate question from the question of creating a system that has human consciousness, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
we admitted that there's tons of organisms and systems that I would want to allow into the borderlands and just say are conscious, right?
Mhm.
And so there's all kinds of ways that those systems can be realized. But if you're talking about the case of an individual human consciousness, yes, it would have to be a informationally identical structure isomorph, right? If it's the case of conscious system, it just has to follow the certain principles, like structural and organizational principles, like IT perhaps,
Yeah.
or some other unknown theory that might come about soon. You hope, one hopes there'll be more, right? You would just need those principles, right? And that's kind of why when I was talking about organoids, it's that presumption of similarity on the structurally and organizationally, or the structure and organization of the systems that matters. That's the ticket, right? Because if you know that, then you know how to put all the pieces together, right?
Hmm.
Which gears go which cogs so that you can move the machine, right? And so in some sense, there's all kinds of ways that we could realize machine consciousness or AGI. It's finding the pieces that actually fit together, I think, is the tricky part,
Yeah.
But the approach is really interesting. There's tons of really interesting approaches there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's so good. Well, finishing up, I got one last one for you. This is from like some work by Eric Olson, and even Susan's done some work on this. Just
Mhm,
about the question of what we talk a lot about artificial intelligence
mhm,
and artificial thinking, but not the AI folks don't always talk about what an artificial thinker would be like, and they say,
mhm,
maybe that's for the metaphysicians or something. But um,
mhm.
what do you think? What would be the artificial thinker in a general artificial general intelligence system? Would it be like the algorithm running? Is it, like the hardware, like some kind of mix in between? Any thoughts on like the ontology of what an artificial thinker would be?
Yeah, it's a cool question, right? And some of the work I did on like AI epistemology stuff, like what does it mean for a system to generate knowledge? I tend to think like if we're asking the question of like what an artificial thinker, a machine thinker,
Yeah.
right? I think about it in terms of this, like various kinds of knowledge producers, right? So
Hmm.
maybe to tease this out, right? You know, AlphaGo Zero was the kind of program that did very well at playing the game Go, so well that it discovered a kind of new opening variant for the game of Go. Game that's been studied for a long time. It developed a new opening, right?
Yeah.
From a pretty common opening sequence of moves, and it came up with a variation of it. In the paper, Carlos Montemayor, we argue that that is a form of knowledge production, right? Has created a novel epistemic good. You know, normally we keep that as like a mark of a thinker,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But a lot of people are reluctant to call AlphaGo Zero a knowledge producer, a knowledge thinker, right? So we kind of come up with a kind of stratification of knowledge producers. I tend to think that anything that would be like an artificial thinker or a machine thinker, right? In some ways, it's going to have those types of constraints that we put on ourselves, right? So, like, the way that I got my PhD was for better or worse, I came up with a novel information theory to metaphysics, right? To explain conscious place in nature. I came up with a product of knowledge or an epistemic good, right? That was novel and distinct enough that a jury and my peers were like, cool, that counts, right? And
Yeah.
I'm knowledge producer. I'm not saying that has to be the bar that everybody needs to be considered a knowledge producer, right?
Right.
That's just a high bar,
Yeah.
right? But I'd be really shocked if like we got to the point where that happened, right? A really novel view about like metaphysics or ontology that was developed by an artificial mind. In my head, I'm like, why would you not count that as an artificial thinker, right?
Seems like a
Or a machine
sufficient
thinker?
condition, even though it's not necessary for everyone, but it seems like it is sufficient.
Yeah, I'd be like, admit that, right?
Yeah.
Again, memorial, admit that just for the
Yeah.
sake of like,
Yeah.
first, it's cool, right? But in that sense, like I think we're gonna start coming more and more close to this, right?
Mm.
Certain large language models, these kind of like stochastic parasitism, I'm less convinced by those. But there are very interesting systems and maybe hybrid architecture systems, these types of things, which are going to start approaching more and more this kind of artificial thinker. It's going to seem more minded, or it's going to seem more like an epistemic agent. I think we need to get a little bit more of a grip on what we mean by that
Yeah.
before that starts happening. That's kind of what Carlos and I kind of talk about. And we put the paper like 4 years ago. It was like right when Alpha Go Zero came out. Of being like, look, like we're going to start getting to the point where artificial systems are producing knowledge, and we should get a grip on how we actually integrate that into our knowledge base or what we mean by it, right? And now we have like Chat GPT and GPT-4 and all that kind of stuff, and it's like kind of running. People are acting like it's running amok, right? And
Yeah.
it's like,
Right.
well, we kind of saw this coming, right? Like we now need to kind of grapple with it, but it's here,
Yeah.
right? And it's going to only get a little bit better, more advances, but yeah.
Yeah, it's so good. And yeah, and Susan's been talking about like her consciousness test type stuff where she's like, don't feed in language and conversations about how we feel about being conscious. Don't do that. And they're like, yeah, whatever. Anyways, and they feed it in, and then GPT-3 sends it back at you, and you're like, "Whoa, it's conscious." Like, well, hold on, guys. This is why you shouldn't have done that, because now we need to parse this out. Um,
Yeah.
when it comes to uh, AI epistemology, robot epistemology type stuff, being a knowledge producer, um, it to me it seems kind of like I lean a little bit more towards like semantic externalism type stuff.
Mhm.
And I could be convinced otherwise, but it seems like most people are leaning that way. If that's the case, then it kind of seems like the AI doesn't own its concepts because they've been like fed into it instead of it having causal contact with the things that it like thinks about. I wonder if you had
Yeah.
any thoughts about whether whether a robot in the Matrix, Neo has kung fu downloaded into his brain. And I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess he can use that, but those concepts shouldn't refer because he doesn't have any like causal interaction.
Mhm.
But maybe that's just a mark against semantic externalism. But I wonder if you had any thoughts about robots, owning their concepts and in
Mhm.
their not in being knowledge producers, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like, maybe there's a broader sense in which I'm committed to maybe a stronger position on this, right? So if I'm making the claim that the way that we differentiate systems, maybe in the metaphysical or ontological sense, is because of the pattern or structure of their information, right?
Oh
These
yeah.
kind of, these lacks of uniformity in space or something like that, right? These informational structures. Well, in some sense, then I'm committed to say you have a sophisticated system, right? And it creates one of these sort of products of knowledge that Carlos and I talk about or something, and the way that they might come about. Well, then you might think, well, if it sufficiently meets that like sufficiently distinct lack of uniformity in nature, right? This pattern of information, then I'm committed to that being, it owns that, right? That is what
Okay.
it is. It is that
It has it.
structure
Yeah.
organized a particular way. It satisfies these kind of external constraints, right? Of maybe producing knowledge or interacting in the knowledge community in a certain way,
Mhm.
right? And I go, yeah, I have to admit that in the same way that I want to admit, I want to admit Parker. I want myself to be admit as Garrett to this kind of knowledge community. I have to. Maybe it's a very alien system. Seems very strange to me. It's a robot thinker. That's jarring for us to grapple with. But I'm going to admit it in the same ways that I want to admit a lot of things in these borderlands. And yeah, I tend to think like, I try to be optimistic about these things, right? Like,
Yeah.
say we're getting to the point where more sophisticated systems are coming out. Like, I actually think it's going to be a pretty interesting time, right? Because in the same way that, um, playing chess or playing Go was very much changed by the advent of AI systems that could achieve like the top level at these games. Something even more interesting happened when you had human AI hybrid teams, right? And then those
Oh
became the
yeah.
best players of the game.
Right.
And I tend to think like we're going to start having that more often, right? Where it's these kind of like called centaurs, right? These human machine dyads, and those are actually the best system. I actually I'm tend to think I'm a little hopeful about that, right? So
Yeah.
like you have you're kind of particularly in terms of epistemic endeavors, right? These types of dynamic duos, right? Sort of say philosopher. Yeah, I would love an AI system that actually did the kind of scholarly work that I'm really bad at doing, which is reading everything possible.
Yeah.
But if
Yeah.
I like synthesizing cool ideas, I like coming up with different views, I like talking about it and hashing out the arguments. I do the reading, right?
Mhm.
Trust that I have read this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I would love that, right? It would be like this kind of, and I tend to think like if we're talking about that, we're talking about this changing epistemic landscape that we're coming into. I think that's the more likely outcome.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of dystopian futures that can come about. But I tend to think like, we are getting to the point, right? And these kind of knowledge-based systems, that seems to be the direction that particularly the next generation is heading towards,
Yeah.
right? If that has Google's knowledge graph or these types of systems, right? There's systems that know things, and that's a different level, right? And I'm inclined to say, to go back to your original question, I'm sorry for my tangent.
Oh, it's good.
Um,
Yeah.
they own those concepts, right? They are unique points of lack of uniformity in terms of their informational structure
Mhm.
and pattern. They own those concepts; those are theirs.
Yeah.
Maybe they got given to us, but I also got given all my concepts, right? Like, I don't, yeah,
That's fascinating. Yeah, yeah, maybe like the content external is more like a historical condition of like you need to have, causally interacted in your past with these things and you're giving more of a constitutive view as like as long as you fit this pattern, then it's yours. That's
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah. In the same way that like something like IT is committed to isomorphic instantiation of a cause and effect structure for IT, right? Integrated information structure
Yeah.
or complex. that has the experience. You know what I mean? And so there is this kind of maybe uncomfortable internalism to it,
Okay.
which I'm happy to be committed to. IT's committed to it to an extent, right?
Yeah.
Which isn't gonna gel with a lot of content externalists.
Sure.
But I'm pathetic to, right, there being a lot of things that we get from reality externally, right? Maybe less so than maybe like IT or maybe particularly like Julio in terms of his like IT, right? But um, ultimately, I do think just having that particular structure, organization, right? That is having the concept. You got it.
Yeah.
Like that is what it is. In the same way that I think IT kind of got it right for experience, like having that internal that gives you the experience, the connection to the environment, or whether or not that experience is veridical, if it's not generated by cause and effect relationship to an environment, it's a different question.
Yeah.
Like, but the state of the system is that.
Yeah. So you could learn
Yeah.
a bunch of information in AR or VR, and then
Mhm.
take that back into the other into base reality, whatever that is, however you find that out,
Yep.
and it's fine. You got the concepts; they still refer because it's a constitutive model. Like no problem. That's pretty sweet. I like that. Um,
Yeah. That gets onto like more of like some of the current work I'm doing on
okay.
like the metaphysics and ontology of digital spaces, given this information theoretic view. So a bit not too dissimilar to maybe like Chalmers like reality plus type stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I just think this information theoretic neutral structuralism has a better way to accommodate that view actually about the reality and existence of digital objects,
Yeah.
right? And even in some sense like our responsibilities and norms in digital spaces, right? Or the nature of relationships in digital spaces. I think I'm kind of committed to the view of, well, these are another level of organization, right? Another spatial temporal grain in which we interact with reality, in which real patterns take place, right? It exists. It exists no different than any other spatial temporal grain or level of reality, right?
Yeah.
And so objects exist. I mean, if you've ever seen someone lose a rare sword in an MMO, you know digital spaces exist to them, right? You know those objects
100%.
exist.
Yes. Right.
So, I mean, I have not seen people passionately argue over things like I have in video games.
Seriously. No,
Those
I'm
objects
with you.
exist
Yeah.
and have a purpose. Um, yeah.
I think you're totally right on that. That's something I was asking Dr. Chalmers about this past weekend. And he goes
Mhm.
in for like, two-dimensional semantics and stuff like that in order to say like, well, no, the certain like simulations don't count, and so you can come to know you live in a simulation and stuff like that. But if you go in for the structural view, yeah, it's fine. It's all in one. You don't even have to worry about like ontological pluralism type stuff where it's like, no, just
Yeah.
structures what's up, and if you find a structure here or find it there, that's okay. It's
Yeah.
fascinating.
And I think it like I think it just has a more elegant way of handling that question,
Yeah.
right? In the sense of you don't have to give this like you said, you don't have to give this complicated explanation about 2D semantics or ontic structure, right? Or pluralism. It just goes, that is the nature of reality.
Yeah.
The reason why it didn't seem to make sense why we're admitting digital reality into our claims about the world, right? Or ontology of the world or metaphysics of the world is because we had the wrong priority question.
Yeah.
How is it the physical mental realizes these types of things? But if you flip it, like I'm saying, right, then it actually makes a lot of sense why digital reality exists in the same way that normal reality does, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it might also sidestep some of the debate about whether Sims could be conscious because what I see is a lot of people saying, well, like simulation hypothesis is false
Mhm.
because I have a first person experience and I think machine functionalism is false because the Chinese room or Chinese nation and therefore I can't be in a simulated world. But it's like, well, if Ontic structural realism is true, then the Sims, if they insofar as they satisfy the same like structural conditions or whatever, like they would
Mhm.
have the same type of consciousness that I would have.
I think I'm committed to
Yeah,
that
yeah,
with
yeah,
this view.
yeah.
I think so, right?
That's
And like
fascinating.
I'm okay with that,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
That
sure.
whatever system is doing that is an incredibly complicated advanced system, right?
Totally.
Um, there's also the kind of like further complication of the thing, which is that we're assuming that like to say the laws of maybe computation or physics in this universe reflect the ones in the universe it's
Totally.
simulating,
Totally.
right? But if you've ever played like some games which just kind of play with the laws of physics, yeah, that doesn't have to be the case,
Right.
right? So like I was thinking, I don't know what that weird game with the guy with the sledgehammer. He's like in the pot. I don't know if you play video
No,
games,
I don't have no idea.
but it plays with physics, right? The whole game is about overcoming like a different kind of like physics
Oh, okay.
reality, right? And so I kind of think like, well, we could be kind of speculating about the nature of computation of physics in a reality that's just totally different in
Right.
terms of it's simulated, right?
Right.
So we may think it's very hard, given our current constraints, right, to simulate enough information structure, right,
Yeah.
and say integrate information for a bunch of sims. Maybe it's not in the universe
Just
that's doing a
one
simulation,
below
right?
us or two, yeah, however many below us. Yeah.
So it actually isn't that computationally uh, impracticable for them. It is within ours, right?
Mm.
Maybe that's just to have runaway computations going on because we try to simulate those realities. That makes me think we might actually be in a simulation. We have these kind of computational constraints built in.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that could have been like a very smart simulator that did that, right?
Yeah.
But
Maybe for moral reasons where they're like, look, we can do this, but we don't really trust you guys to be doing this as well. Yeah.
yeah, to be fair, I think that's probably the
Yeah.
right choice.
Yeah.
They observed us that
Yeah.
role.
That might mess with the with Bostrom's argument about all the different, nested simulations and why, the bland indifference principle should say that you are in one. But, um
Yeah, yeah,
all right, so last one here, I promise.
yeah.
Um when it comes to Ontic structural realism and going in for the structure view, uh so I'm a theist myself, so I always I always jump to like the theism too fast probably too,
Mhm,
but I'm wondering if you have any kind of like speculation as to why these structures, like why is
mhm.
there a structure that produces conscious minds like ours? Like, do you think it's just a cosmic accident, or yeah, what do you make of that?
It's a good question. I mean, maybe it might be more telling what my response would be like if I said, something of a kind of absurdist about it all, right? So I
Nice.
think like looking for this kind of like question about like where does meaning or value come from, right? To some extent, maybe I've given up on that chase, right?
Mm.
I just accepted like it's just the structures and the patterns, like it's just that. Maybe that's just like for my own sanity, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But in sense of why is it these particular ones over other ones? I guess in some ways they're the ones that happened,
Yeah.
and so we grapple with that, right?
Yeah.
Now there's some maybe there is something maybe telling, right? You might think like what like anthropic principle type things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
and in some sense maybe that could just be of all maybe the multiverse of all the universes that could have happened. This is the one that informationally organized the way in which we got these kind of complex interactions. But take right, maybe we could go back to Wolfram, right? His cellular automata, right? Certain rules produce pretty uninteresting patterns, right? And then other rules that seem simple produce incredibly what seem like pseudo random patterns,
Yeah.
right? Or as for all intents and purposes, random patterns. There's a sufficient level of complexity, right? But why did that happen? It
Yeah.
just did.
Right.
Right, it just did. In the same way that Wolfram didn't know that Rule 30 was gonna be the one that showed him a kind of complexity of pattern that he wasn't expecting.
Hmm.
In some ways, the way that this whole got organized,
Yeah.
it showed us the kind of complexity and organization that happened, but, just in some ways, maybe it's just the Rule 30, right? It's just the
Yeah.
Rule 30 of the habitat, and unfortunately, we're just not gonna get a good answer to that.
Yeah. That's
So
fascinating.
maybe that's where it bottoms out, right? Like,
Yeah.
I do think there's a question of this place in reality. Where the ultimate, like, status of why it got organized that way, maybe that's just the one that can't be answered, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Man, we went deep. We went super deep today. Thanks for letting me like take you down rabbit trails. This has been awesome.
It is my favorite way to do philosophy, so I was more than happy
It's awesome.
to, go down the rabbit hole, yeah.
Yeah. So, for the listeners who are now intrigued by your work and your stuff, like, where can they find some more of your stuff?
Yeah, so I'm currently supposed to be working on a, book proposal, so I'm working on that to kind of give this more general picture on information theoretic neutral structuralism. But if you want to follow my work, follow the Center for the Future Mind.
Awesome.
Please sign up. We're gonna have tons of events going on. We're trying to make Southern Florida a bit of a hotbed for these types of topics about
Yeah.
like future of AI, philosophy, mind, intelligence, consciousness.
It's a great place to do
Basically, all
it
this
too. It's always warm, so we're always happy to leave Illinois
3
and
miles
yeah,
each. You got like tiki bars and
that's
not
right.
a bad place to do philosophy.
Yeah.
I'm getting used to the heat because I'm used to cold climates, but it's not bad. Yeah, but yeah, I'm gonna be doing more work on this kind of metaphysics of consciousness stuff. Should have some stuff coming out in science of consciousness. So yeah, hopefully your readers aren't too bored after this very long
No, dude,
conversation.
they're gonna love this. This is awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah. Awesome.
yeah.
All right, folks. Well, that's going to have to do it for now. I'll put the link to the Center for the Future Mind in the description. So you can find more there. Thanks for sticking around. If you guys like this, leave me a comment and a like. And as always, all glory to God.